Okay, hi everybody. Bonjour et bienvenue à tout le monde à cette panel virtuel sur un plan d'action national pour les campements, solutions au sans-abrisme fondées sur les droits de la personne. Hello and welcome everyone to a virtual panel discussion on human rights and solutions to homelessness, a National Encampment Response Plan. Because we'll be having panelists today speaking in both French and English, I'll take folks through a bit of technology so that people have access. Pour ceux qui nous joignent en français, les sous-titres sont disponibles pour cet événement. Pour les utiliser, appuyez sur le bouton qui dit CC au fond de votre écran. Assurez que le langage de sous-titrage reflète votre langue préférée. De plus, s'il vous plaît, assurez que l'option pour la traduction est engagée. Cela va assurer que vos sous-titres vont subsister dans vos langues préférées. Et finalement, on a aussi l'interprétation en direct. Alors, vous pouvez cliquer « Interprétation » au fond de votre écran et sélectionner votre langue préférée. In English, captioning is available for this event. To enable captions, please click the little CC button at the bottom of your screen and ensure that caption language is set to your preferred language. Please also ensure that translation option is turned on so that when you see the slides, as panelists are speaking in both French and English for the event, the translation option will ensure that captions remain in your preferred language throughout. And we have live French-English interpretation available by clicking interpretation at the bottom of your Zoom screen and selecting the language that you prefer. I'll give folks a minute to go through that. We will also, for technology support and other accessibility questions, you can message my colleague Sahar Raza by direct message in the chat. You can also just post in the chat. And for support in French, you can please message Rick Matien with any questions you have. And a final note, this session is being recorded so that we can make it available online as a resource afterwards. The National Right to Housing Network wants to ensure that its online meetings and events are welcome to all people, and especially people with lived experience of homelessness and inadequate housing, and also folks who are intersectionally equity denied. We want this to be a respectful space. And so it's important for us that the voices of those most impacted are actively included, listened to, and respected. So for this reason, we'll ask all participants to honor NHRN's Respectful Space Agreement. There'll be a link in the chat if you'd like to review it. We do have a Q&A board set up as well as a chat. So we encourage people to engage actively in the chat, share relevant information, ask questions, and also please be mindful that that respectful space agreement applies in the chat as well. So please share space, make room for everyone. If folks can share equally and avoid filling up the space or engaging with self-promotion or comments that might not be relevant to today's topic. And in a way that, we ensure that our dialogue in that chat space honors human rights, dignity, and the participation of everyone who's here today. You can post questions or comments in the chat throughout in French or in English. Staff from both the Federal Housing Advocates Office and the National Right to Housing Network will be available to respond to questions throughout, and we'll be reviewing the chat throughout. Also, we'll be gathering questions for a small Q&A at the end. So if you really want to make sure that your question pops into that Q&A at the end, you can put it in the chat, but you might also want to put it in that Q&A box to make sure that we see it for the end of today's session. And now we're going to move into the substance of our session. Canada's homeless encampments are, in the words of the advocate, a national human rights crisis. And it's together among this group of people here today and your colleagues, friends, families, and communities, and in collaboration with people who are living in encampments, that we really do have an opportunity to be part of building solutions that center and honor Indigenous rights, human rights, dignity, and autonomy. Panelists are here today to offer paths forward to build healthier, safer, and stronger communities for everyone. And in building this work together, we really hope that you'll engage thoughtfully, that you'll commit to action today, tomorrow, and until we have access to adequate and affordable housing for everyone. We need each other in this work. We need all of us, because if not you, who? And so as we open the event, we must not only acknowledge the diverse and expansive Indigenous lands from which we are all joining, we need also to center and seek to understand the diverse Indigenous laws and understandings of land that have operated on these lands since time immemorial. This crisis has its genesis in the establishment of British common law and French civil law on Indigenous lands. It was through those earliest days of settlement, as settlers dragged lengths of chain across Indigenous land to carve out sections of land for European settlers, that the path towards this crisis was set. And it is in conceiving of land and housing as a private for-profit based system that prioritizes individual wealth over stewardship of land and security of communities that we have come to this point. And so it is no surprise that Indigenous people continue to be disproportionately and differently impacted by this country's housing crisis, and are among those who are living in encampments at rates far greater than the percentage of the population. So we are in a crisis. But encampments are also not new. Encampments have been part of our communities in various ways throughout this country's history. What is new is the staggering number of people who now have to rely on encampments for basic necessities. Homeless count numbers are going up year over year as affordable housing becomes less and less available. And the level of backlash and the level of danger that people face, even from their own neighbors, is also at a crisis point. And we are also entering an era of human rights and housing rights. 20 years ago, the constitutional rights of people living in tents and under tarps was not even a thought to governments and courts. Today, those rights are front and center. Today, this country has an advocate who is demanding change. It is through that human rights approach that we will see better days. So before we get started, I'm going to ask folks to take a moment to reflect on your home communities. As we speak, right now, we know that encampment residents who've called Crab Park in Vancouver's downtown East Side home for many months are facing displacement. And we know that camps are being swept regularly. People's belongings are destroyed, communities separated, and individuals are harmed as we are sitting here today. There's a link to an open letter in support of the residents of Crab Park that will be in the chat. We offer it in case there are folks who would like to offer their support to that letter. And we have all lost loved ones to this crisis. You will be hearing from a panelist from Edmonton, where homeless people are dying at a rate 8 times the rate compared to pre-pandemic. And Edmonton is not alone. In that city alone, 302 loved ones were lost in 2023. And that is happening across the country. So in the practice that has been long established by organizations led by people who use drugs, like the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users and like the Western Aboriginal Harm Reduction, I'd like to offer that we take a moment of silence to honor the people we've lost, the people we miss. Take a moment to hold their names in your mind and in your heart. Okay. Without further ado, let's meet these panelists. Their bios will be in the chat for you to learn more about them, so we'll just be introducing folks' names. Today we have joining us Anna Cooper, lawyer with Pivot Legal Society, Delilah Gregg, the president of Western Aboriginal Harm Reduction, Lorraine Lamb and Nikki Sutherland with Outreach in downtown East Toronto, Caroline Leblanc, researcher at l'Université de Sherbrooke, Chris Wiebe, lawyer at Engel Law, Gail Mushirahamwe, research coordinator at the National Association of Friendship Centers, and of course, the federal housing advocate. Marie-Josée Houle, Canada's first housing advocate, the person who has led the human rights review on encampments across the country and who will take us through this panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, DJ. Thank you to the National Right to Housing Network. And I want to welcome all the participants. Bienvenue. I have the sobering privilege of being able to join you today from the ceded or unceded and traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And when I think of encampments and people living in situations of housing precarity and homelessness, this territorial acknowledgement is the word sobering, because someone reminded me that the term unceded means stolen. And this really guides me in my work as your federal housing advocate. And I think we need to make pause, really, to take pause to think about what this means. I'm also honored to be on this panel with leaders who have been advocating for the human rights of encampment residents for so long. And I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion. So I'm going to keep my remarks brief. The slides that you're about to see are available on the website in English and in French for those who want more information. So I launched my review of encampments just over 1 year ago. And it's been a collaborative effort from the beginning. And my review to build on research and advocacy by leaders and experts across, across the country. The work has been incredibly extensive, and I want to thank all of you for that. Cela comprend un rapport de Caroline Leblanc sur la situation des campements du Québec. And sorry, this is taking a while because I'm switching captions from French to English. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to continue this. But over the last year, I met with the frontline service providers, advocates, Indigenous governments, and representative organizations, and for federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments across the country. And most importantly, I've had the opportunity to meet and speak with encampment residents across the country. It's been a humbling experience to witness their determination to claim their basic right to a home. And thanks to the efforts of many of you here today, more than 350 individuals and organizations sent submissions about their experiences in encampments. And the final report was launched in February to huge media attention. I did 23 interviews in 2 days, and the stories keep coming. So I know many of you have spoken to your local media as well. And cette conversation avec les médias contribue à mettre en lumière l'urgence des problèmes et la nécessité d'adopter de nouvelles approches ancrées dans les obligations du Canada en matière de droits de la personne. Dans mon rapport, je conclus que le Canada ne respecte pas ses obligations en matière de droits de la personne, et la crise des droits de la personne comporte 2 éléments. Tout d'abord, les résidents de campements risquent fort de subir les préjudices en raison du non-respect de leurs droits fondamentaux. Et ensuite, les campements n'existent qu'en raison d'un échec plus large et des systémiques à faire respecter les droits à tous à un logement adéquat sans discrimination. People living in encampments are experiencing a multitude of human rights violations, and the situation seems to be getting worse. And these are rights protected in international human rights treaties that Canada has committed to uphold. You are all too familiar with these human rights violations, failure to provide necessities of life, forced evictions, inaccessible and under-resourced shelters. Governments are not doing enough to fulfill their obligations, and the report recognizes that encampments are not a safe or sustainable solution for housing. And for people living in encampments, every day is an assault on their human dignity and can be a matter of life and death. Most importantly, homelessness crisis in Canada is also an Indigenous rights crisis. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who are grossly overrepresented among people living outside. Je peux affirmer qu'avec une certitude absolue, que nous ne résoudrons pas cette crise sans une réponse nationale concertée, coordonnée et globale. Il faut que les gouvernements fédéraux, provinciaux, territoriaux, municipaux et autochtones travaillent ensemble. Tous les ministères et les organismes concernés doivent mettre l'épaule à la roue, non seulement le logement, mais aussi la santé, la sécurité publique, les services d'urgence, la justice et surtout les relations avec les personnes autochtones et les services qui leur sont destinés. So if governments continue to treat this solely as a housing issue, to be solved only by departments and agencies directly responsible for housing, we will not succeed. And that is why my most important recommendation is for a National Encampments Response Plan. The national response needs to be multifaceted and will need to address the current crisis as well as the systemic drivers of homelessness and encampments. It must also integrate meaningful engagement with people with lived experience of encampments and the people that work with them. And the urgent call for a National Encampments Response Plan is designed to be an umbrella for a range of actions that all governments must take. The plan must be in place by August 31st of 2024. It must be based in human rights and developed through meaningful engagement with encampment residents. It must convene all governments, including Indigenous governments. It has to include new resources, and it must strengthen collaboration and a coordinated and consistent human rights-based response from all governments. This national response plan is the focus of today's conversation. Other calls to actions are important components of the national response plan, and they are to ensure people have the basic necessities of life, to stop forced evictions on public lands, meaningful engagement with encampment residents, implement UNDRIP and uphold Indigenous rights, recognize and uphold Canada's human rights obligations, and finally, accelerate the offer of permanent housing options and address the root causes of encampments. More details are available on the slides and in the report, but I want to stop here so we have plenty of time for discussion. So now I want to turn to the experts. You are the ones on the front line of this crisis. In the face of immense barriers, you're creating solutions and defending human rights. And I want to start by asking each of you to tell us about your work. And Gael, I want to start with you. Encampments are a human rights issue and a housing issue, but it's also fundamentally an issue of Indigenous rights. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people are vastly overrepresented in encampments across the country. Across the country, friendship centers have been on the front lines supporting people who are unhoused. So, Gaia, can you tell us a bit about the engagement process that the NAFC have done on the issue and that you heard about the role, that friendship centers are playing in protecting the rights of Indigenous encampment residents?
Of course. I would first like to start off by saying thank you so much for the invitation to be a part of this panel. I have the honor of joining you all virtually from the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. I would also like to thank all of the friendship centers that welcomed us and this project, as well as entrusting us with their experiences and their stories. So the National Association of Friendship Centers is a network of over 100 friendship centers and provincial and territorial associations from coast to coast to coast. So in partnership with the Office of Federal Housing Advocate, we were granted with the opportunity to bring a unique lens when discussing encampments, gaining insight from the perspective of frontline workers and people that work tirelessly with individuals that are experiencing either precarious housing, homelessness, or with folks living in encampments. So by engaging with friendship centers, we were able to have enriching conversations on the rollout of housing and homelessness programs and supports, learn more about the cultivation of relationships with neighboring encampment communities, and have a better understanding of the experience of service delivery organizations working to ensure that the needs and rights of urban Indigenous folks living in encampments are being respected and upheld. So with answering your question, I think it would be a great opportunity to share some of the big takeaways from our engagement sessions. So in conversation with the Manitoba Association of Friendship Centers and the Winnipeg Indigenous Friendship Center, we really discussed the importance of relationship and partnership building. And we were talking about partnerships built with those, supplying construction materials, to the architects that are working on the design of the home, to the relationship building with other Indigenous organizations that are working in the housing and homelessness sector. And in these conversations, we highlighted the importance of reducing the competitive nature in receiving supports and funding, and working together on creating a unified stance when addressing precarious housing and homelessness. And we also kind of went into the conversation that, this competitive nature could also be influenced by limited opportunities to receiving adequate funding to supporting these initiatives. In conversation with the Prince George Native Friendship Center and the Des Alcant Friendship Center, there was an emphasis on racism being a huge systemic and social barrier. Racism materializes itself in the policies associated with obtaining housing, individuals being put on long wait lists for supports, the treatment of Indigenous people living in encampments or that are experiencing homelessness or precarious housing, displacement, bylaw and police treatment, receiving and accessing services, and even in the treatment of Indigenous-led organizations providing these supports to those living in encampments. So this is a huge barrier that so many experience, and without fully addressing racism and Canada's colonial history, it will continue to pose a huge threat to the incredible work that Friendship Centers and other service delivery organizations provide on a daily basis. Which then kind of leads into the conversation that we had with the Labrador Friendship Center. We dedicated time to discuss the lack of supports. So not only through funding and resources, but also the acknowledgement of the work that Friendship Centers have and continue to do to support their communities, really looking at public perception and buy-in, and also in the relationship with all levels of government. So without the support from a town, for example, it becomes another barrier and further stigmatizes those living in encampments. So not only are Friendship Centers working to supply those supports to ensure that the safety and the well-being of those living in encampments, but it also having to continuously do advocacy work on this side, which then kind of goes into another topic of relationship building with neighboring encampment communities. So relationships built on trust and creating a space where people feel safe and know that they can have their needs met. So meeting people where they're at with so much dignity and respect is vital to this work. And some folks choose to live in encampments because it does provide them with a sense of autonomy. And Friendship Centers respect that. So even in our conversation with Friendship Centers, the language used when describing the supports that they provide, so maintaining rather than erasing encampments. So overall, with all of the Friendship Centers we were able to engage with, either in person, virtually, or through surveys, the biggest takeaway is the importance of wraparound services. It's not only about putting a roof over someone's head, but also ensuring that they have the right tools and supports to live a good life. As highlighted in OFHA's report, the importance of a human rights approach when in the housing and homelessness sector is vital. And this has been an approach that the Friendship Center movement has embodied since its conception. So rather than solely relying on others to adopt this model, why not lean onto those that have operated solely through this model and this lens? And why not acknowledge organizations like the Friendship Center movement, who are experts in providing supports to urban Indigenous communities, for example? And why can't
Gail, I'm going to cut you off right now, but thank you so much. You have brought so much to the conversation, and I can't wait to unpack it. I want to take this conversation to Vancouver now and hear from Anna and Delilah. Pivot in BC has been doing advocacy on encampments since long before the pandemic made them the national crisis we see today. And in part, thanks to the advocacy, Crab Park is one of the few legally sanctioned encampments. But just yesterday, I mean, we're still seeing residents displaced. So can you tell us more about what's happening there right now?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Just repeat, Anna Cooper. I'm a lawyer at Pivot Legal Society. I'm here with Delilah Gregg, president of Western Aboriginal Harm Reduction. on the stolen and unceded lands of the Musqueam and Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'll speak briefly to a few major challenges and then pass things over to Delilah. Because while we have seen, and it's reflected in the attendance today, a huge increase over the last decade of advocates on the ground, lawyers doing cases, there's still so much pushback when we try and support people. So one key issue we continue to face is the way in which government actors continue to prioritize performing ethical evictions over actually taking the actions that will make people safe long term. A really key example that we see over and over is when government actors make comments about people's rights, about respecting the right to housing, while they're actively paying for their lawyers to go to court to ensure that those rights are not enshrined in law or as defined as narrowly as possible. What's happening at Crab Park right now is another excellent example of that. We have the city of Vancouver coming out with press releases that would make it sound like what they're doing on the ground is a supportive operation, close collaboration with residents. But what we know from residents and advocates who are actually there is that this is a violent mass eviction process where people's possessions are being destroyed and people's input on what would actually make them safe is not being listened to. And that's what we've seen many, many, many times. Another key issue that we're seeing is simply just not enough people showing up on the ground and online. You cannot underestimate the importance of visible resistance, of being present when things are happening to people, and the ways that that shifts both the public narrative, but also can create concrete safety for people while like evictions are happening. Simply that there's more witnesses and government knows that they're being watched. I completely recognize many people due to personal life circumstances, their own risk when facing police, disabilities can't be on the ground, but you can still amplify if you're in or near so-called Vancouver, amplifying Stop the Sweeps, changing the literal algorithm on what people hear and see around these situations. And the last thing I'll mention before handing to Delilah is frontline workers are continuing to be weaponized by government during these actions. So City of Vancouver issued an email yesterday where they list every nonprofit that is a part of this operation, and they are using them as cover to make it sound like this is an ethical operation. And that is what is happening to all of you. I recognize that many frontline workers go to these spaces to try and harm reduce extremely awful situations. So I'm not saying don't go, but this is an ask to make sure you're talking to residents, make sure they want you there, make sure you're being clear publicly about why you are there, and do not participate in eviction processes. And that can look like not identifying which tents are empty. That can look like not telling government exactly how many people have been housed and how many are left to justify the end of eviction processes. It's complicated and you have to work together. Delilah. When we were talking about this report a bit, you raised some concerns around how government might respond to this report. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, hi everybody, and thank you for the work that you're doing, and I certainly do appreciate it. The government actually needs to make the changes, and they need to work with the people. They need to maybe even come down to a location where there are homeless people and sit with them and have a discussion and be compassionate. We want the government to plan to do better. We want the government to be able to sit with people and plan to make it better for them, instead of just doing a lot of blah, 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 not getting anything done, right? Because, I mean, the people voted the government in, and I just, we believed in them, and it's like they make all these promises and then all of a sudden they get in and it's like nothing happens, right? So they got to stop dressing the table and serve the feast and make the feast be a good one for everybody, to work together to make it better, right? Because people are dying and it's really sad, and people are being traumatized badly. And we need more services for the people, right? And Yeah, it shocks me about what's happening at Crab Park. It really hurts. It does. And all the people that have lost their lives and not having a home. And, you know, I don't think it was this bad in Vancouver, downtown Eastside, even like 15 years ago. Yeah, I don't know. Something's got to give. Something's got to really give. And government needs to work with the people, right? And for the people to make it better.
Thank you so much for
Thanks.
that. You know, and I think you make us realize that in all of this, you know, we have to continue to humanize the issue, that, you know, these are real people, these are real lives. Alors, passons maintenant au Québec. Caroline, en tant que chercheur ayant une expérience vécue de l'itinérance, vous avez travaillé en étroite collaboration avec les résidents de campement pour documenter leurs perspectives et et leurs expériences. Pourquoi est-il important que les décideurs politiques entendent directement le point de vue des personnes qui restent dans les campements? Et on a appris que le travail ben, concernant le travail, comment est-ce qu'on peut faire un engagement vraiment significatif? Parce qu'on voit souvent qu'on a déjà eu les conversations, mais alors comment est-ce qu'on sait qu'on a bien fait le travail d'engagement?
Merci, Marie-Josée. Tout d'abord, je tiens à vous remercier pour l'invitation de prendre part au webinaire, l'ensemble des personnes présentes aujourd'hui. Et je tiens à reconnaître aussi que je suis présente sur les terres non cédées des Abénaquis dans l'Estrie, au Québec. Alors, ce que j'ai vraiment compris sur le terrain à travers mon ethnographie critique et participative, qui a été menée par et pour les personnes qui ont un savoir d'expérience, c'est-à-dire les personnes qui ont vécu ou qui vivent dans la rue, c'est que, dans le fond, les personnes qui vivent en campement ont vraiment la capacité d'analyser et d'être critiques envers les services qui leur sont offerts et de convenir de ce qui est approprié ou pas dans l'organisation de leur vie. Et j'en viens donc à dire qu'ils ressentent aussi le besoin de partager ces multiples oppressions qu'elles vivent et qu'elles apprécient par le fait même quand on leur laisse l'occasion de parler de leurs forces. Alors, c'est pourquoi que je crois que les décideurs doivent vraiment les entendre parce qu'ils sont les mieux placés pour mettre de l'avant les lacunes du système qui les opprime, mais aussi ce qui fonctionne. Et c'est certain que leur perception peut vraiment aider les décideurs à mieux comprendre les problématiques, mais aussi les bonnes pratiques à tenir en compte dans la réponse au campement. On parle de décideurs ici, mais l'ensemble des personnes devraient se sentir interpellées dans leurs actions par l'importance d'entendre la population qui vit en campement, puis d'inverser un peu nos schèmes de référence du top-bottom vers le bottom-up, en considérant vraiment leur voix et leur savoir à part égale aux autres. Donc, une chose que j'ai vraiment compris, c'est qu'à travers mes différentes implications avec les personnes en campement, c'est ils ont toutes envie d'être entendues et qu'elles ont l'intérêt de s'engager et de se mobiliser quand on leur laisse la possibilité de le faire, puis que ça peut vraiment faire une différence. Sauf qu'en ce moment, c'est un peu difficile parce que trop souvent, même si elles essaient de prendre la parole, on leur refuse de s'exprimer ou leur voix est vraiment simplement pas prise en considération. Puis, je tiens à mentionner que la répression est tellement forte envers elles que ça vient nuire à leur participation sociale et ça continue de les invisibiliser du débat qui les concerne directement. Alors, pour répondre à ta question, je crois qu'il faut, pour favoriser leur engagement, il faut cesser les démantèlements pour que les personnes bénéficient d'une stabilité, pour qu'elles puissent justement faciliter leur engagement, mais aussi pour qu'elles regagnent une certaine confiance en leur démontrant notre réelle volonté de les soutenir, puis de vouloir travailler avec elles à trouver des solutions viables, décentes, adaptées et durable aussi. Tu sais, une tente, c'est pas juste une tente qu'on déplace, c'est tout un espace de vie. Une personne qui a des besoins fondamentaux pour se déposer quelque part, exister sans devoir se cacher. Donc, pour favoriser leur engagement, il faut mettre des engagements, en fait, des opportunités selon leurs capacités puis leurs besoins. Et pour ça, ben, il faut les entendre en considérant c'est quoi les meilleures façons de faire. Alors, ça retourne encore à entendre leur voix pour comment on implique réellement, comment on peut avoir une réelle implication. Il ne faut pas consulter pour consulter, hein? Il ne faut pas faire les choses à moitié, il ne faut pas vouloir gagner du temps. Il faut vraiment faire autrement. Et je tiens aussi à mentionner qu'il ne faut pas toujours mettre en valeur aussi les voies qui sont les plus, qui ont le plus d'aisance. Il faut développer d'autres opportunités pour que d'autres personnes développent des compétences pour élever leur voix. Donc, pour moi, c'est vraiment de faire preuve d'une volonté, flexibilité, créativité et de sortir de notre monde de bureaucratie, ben, de sortir du monde bureaucratisé. Hey, j'ai de la misère avec ce mot-là. Et donc, de faire preuve de plus d'humanité. Alors, voilà, Marie-Josée.
Merci beaucoup. And over to Edmonton now, Chris. The legal action in Edmonton tried to build on precedents in BC and Waterloo and injunction applications on behalf of people living in encampments in Hamilton and Toronto. And what have you learned about the legal advocacy on this issue as a result of action, the result and evictions that followed? And what do you see as the future of legal advocacy for encampment residents' human rights?
Thank you, Marie-Josée. On Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, my co-counsel and I brought a lawsuit seeking a declaration that the City of Edmonton's encampment eviction policy had breached unsheltered people's rights under Section 7 of the Charter by causing thousands of encampment evictions from city land over the course of 2 years, during which time there was never adequate accessible shelter space. We also brought an interim injunction application to put limits on the city's eviction policy in the meantime while we waited for trial. Both legal actions were unsuccessful because on January 16th, the court decided that our client, a local nonprofit called the Coalition for Justice and Human Rights, did not have public interest standing to bring the legal actions at all. Our legal action did enjoy some success, though. It brought national attention to the plight of unsheltered Edmontonians, and in December, we were able to get an interim injunction order placing restrictions on a mass encampment closure that the police and the city had planned right before the holidays. That contributed to the city's decision to alter its encampment eviction policy and declare a houselessness emergency. Still, we were deeply disappointed that the court dismissed our legal action on standing and then decided to award over $11,000 in costs against our client. We watched in dismay in the days after the court denied our client standing as the Edmonton Police Service drastically escalated encampment evictions and the City of Edmonton erected fencing around many parks and empty parking lots in the east end of downtown to prevent anyone from sheltering there. From these experiences, the action itself, all the public attention, the frustrating results, and the silver linings, I learned a lot. I learned encampment evictions cause many harms to our unsheltered neighbors. They cause people to lose essential property, expose people to extreme weather, and increase risks of drug poisonings. They isolate people, re-traumatize them, and to Indigenous unsheltered people who make up at least 65% of unsheltered Edmontonians, they perpetuate the colonial history of forced displacement. I also learned about the power of organized public protest in motivating elected officials to act. Our legal action's success was primarily as a spark that ignited public outcry at the plight of people living in encampments in Edmonton. That put pressure on elected officials to act. We had a network of community organizations who our team collaborated with to organize legal observers, protests, open letters, and email campaigns. Those efforts were crucial. In the future, I believe that public interest lawyers in the prairie provinces must continue to take action on behalf of people living in encampments. The cold weather and the fact that most people experiencing forced displacement in prairie cities are Indigenous make doing so morally urgent. Ideally, such legal actions should be done in collaboration with local organizers who can help the legal actions also become moments for great public pressure on elected officials. I hope that by bringing legal actions and organizing public protests, we can help the federal housing advocates' recommendations become a reality. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chris. And finally, let's come back east to Toronto. Lorraine and Nikki, last year, Toronto's ombudsman released a report on his investigation of the violent police-led evictions of Toronto encampments in the summer of 21. And at the time, The city accepted the report's recommendations and committed to fairer treatment of people who are unhoused. What differences are you seeing in the day-to-day conditions for people in encampments since the report was released? What barriers do you see, to the implementation of its recommendations? What is needed to ensure that reports and recommendations contribute to lasting change?
Hi. Okay, so Nikki wants to go first. You might see an appearance from her dog Indy every now and then. So Nikki, there was a report done that said homeless people in encampments need to be treated with compassion. What do you think about that?
Yeah, compassion, that's essential because I think a lot of the homeless people would want people to know that they care, right? Because then they'll be more motivated with compassion to keep pursuing the housing. And
Yeah. So what you're saying is that people who are living in encampments need to know that they're cared about. So
Yeah.
being treated with compassion feels like the bare minimum. You know, we were talking as well about do you think that encampments are being treated better these days compared to when you were in an encampment? What do you think?
well, there's not as many as forceful evictions, but I have a feeling it feels like the security and this place in encampments these days are there mostly for the public, not for the safety of the homeless people there. Because there were some situations that I was told people were asking for help, and the security there didn't even move they didn't even move from their station to go assist.
Wow.
And why are they spending money hiring security and extra police and stuff instead of putting that money towards
Housing.
Yeah, housing and condos and stuff like that,
Yeah. I just want to, so that was a really good point. So you said, sure, it seems like encampments are being treated better because you don't see them.
It's for the public's reassurance that mostly it feels like. So
Yeah, so you're saying it feels like the cities are just hiring security, but it's not really about the safety of people in encampments. It's really just about the illusion of safety.
There's a lot of situations where the security didn't assist in.
Yeah, so they're not actually helping the people who are in encampments. It's really just for everybody else's. Yeah, I think that's connected to one of the things I wanted to talk about as well. I think, sure, we're not seeing as visible of forced evictions here in Toronto, but there is still a pressure to move people along. It's almost like a compassionate displacement, which I would say is an oxymoron. Ultimately, we're still seeing cities respond to neighborhood pressures who are complaining about encampments. And so they're implementing, sure, more services, but they're prioritizing people in encampments for housing, which means that they're displacing people who are sleeping in ravines who have been more hidden. And I would also say, one of the barriers to implementing this report, connected to what Nikki was saying, is we've weaponized this language of safety, whether it's fire safety or, housed neighbors feeling unsafe. We've just weaponized this illusion of safety. And instead of actually centering the safety and the needs of the people who are most vulnerable in encampments, we're just dancing around it. And I think that's a huge barrier to implementing some of the things we're talking about. And I would say the other piece in terms of a barrier is we're talking a lot about how housing is a human right. But my sense of one of the barriers is that I don't think people in encampments are seen as human enough to deserve human rights. And so one of the biggest barriers I see is how do we humanize what's happening instead of constantly othering the narratives of people who are poor and unhoused? Because I think all of these things that we're talking about make a lot of sense in this space. Everybody agrees, yeah, housing is a human right, of course. But you talk to neighbors who are complaining about encampments, and it's clear that people who are poor are not considered human enough. And therefore
or good enough
or deserving enough. And therefore we need to feel safe against those people, which then continue this perpetual weaponization of safety language.
Or they get judged or first before anything.
Yeah, or people get judged. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
No.
Okay.
Well, let's move on to an open discussion because I look forward to hearing what else you've got to say. So this This question is for everyone. I want to talk about the future. So I've called on the federal government to create a national response to the plan by August 31st of this year. And it's, why some people say, this is so fast. But one, we can't have another winter like what we've had. So what do you want to see in the plan that could make a difference to your community? Qu'est-ce que vous souhaitez voir dans le plan national qui ferait une différence dans votre communauté? Just go ahead and raise your hand if you've got something you want to add. Go ahead, Anna.
So I think a really important thing in that plan is taking this clear position that the right to housing includes a right to reject inadequate housing. There's a level in which the federal government needs to push back against the stigma that Lorraine and Nikki just spoke about. That they need to actually recognize that people have rights and that those rights can't be lowered just because it's uncomfortable. And we need them to not participate in what we keep saying, which is this infantilization and medicalization of people outside. The federal government can't, on the one hand, recognize the legacies of colonialism and racism across so-called Canada, and on the other hand, claim that everybody outside is too mentally ill to have an opinion about their own needs. If it's systemic harm, it's systemic solutions based on the people who've been hurt.
Does anyone else want to jump in on this, or can I ask another question? Yeah, Caroline.
Merci beaucoup. Ben, en fait, je souhaiterais vraiment qu'il y ait des actions concrètes, là, pas juste pas juste des écrits, mais qui proposent des choses vraiment, des actions concrètes, comme par exemple mettre un protecteur de l'itinérance indépendant et neutre, parce que c'est hyper important pour qu'il y ait les personnes en commun aient des repères plus précis pour exprimer les injustices et la discrimination, puis de voir des stratégies aussi qui permettent de mieux connaître leurs droits et un processus de plainte vraiment simple et accessible. Donc, tu sais, de mettre en avant là, toute la possibilité là, que les personnes puissent être autonomes dans la défense de leurs droits aussi, puis soutenir les organismes là, qui peuvent venir apporter un soutien supplémentaire. Donc, c'est un peu ce que je souhaiterais vraiment voir.
Okay, anyone else? Chris?
I'd like to see a national standard for what the exceptional circumstances in which encampment evictions would be appropriate. Those limited exceptional circumstances should be specific to avoid abuse at a local level. Certainly appreciate seeing a national standard of that nature, as well as a national standard on procedure for if encampment closures are to proceed in certain exceptional circumstances. How do they go about doing that in a way that mitigates harm to the displaced people?
Thanks. Nikki, Lorraine, Gael, or do I move on to another question? Okay. What would be the ideal role of the federal government in working with provinces, municipalities, and Indigenous governments to get this plan implemented? Anyone have any thoughts?
If I could quickly chime in, throughout our engagements, one thing that struck me was someone had said, approval isn't a partnership. And so ensuring that there are equitable relationships and partnership building with organizations and folks that are continuously working on the ground, I think is vital, and prioritizing the voices and the experiences of those with lived experiences, I think is also vital in ensuring this work. I think also the recognition that there are existing processes and systems and plans placed to do this work. So not coming in and reinventing the wheel, but rather amplifying and giving so many experts and so many grassroots organizations the opportunity to continue to do their work with the needed supports and funding. So yeah, thanks.
Great. Anyone else? So based on your experiences, And we've talked a little bit about this. What should the minister be wary of in developing the plan? Are there any pitfalls to avoid? And I think, we've heard a little bit about this in Toronto as well, around lip service, and for whom you're developing the plan. But if anyone wants to elaborate on that or take this into another direction. Yep, Anna?
So this goes to what I said before, which is prioritizing the removal of people from public space over actually what will keep them safest while we are building out long-term housing solutions. There's such a strong push from government to remove visible homelessness and prioritizing that over what is actually safest. And people on the ground will tell you over and over and over and over that often the safest option for them is being outside. By all means, make existing low-income housing better, make transition housing better, make shelters better. Let the people who say that is safest for them access those spaces. Do not use those spaces to supposedly ethically evict people. If you have to use the threat of police violence to make someone accept your help, it's not help. Like, you have failed. The moment you are required to use the threat of police to get someone to take your help, it's not help. Another thing is to avoid compromising to the point you create programs that are designed to fail, and then use that failure to justify what you've been doing before. So Delisle and I were talking about this a bit, and how, for example, government approaches to decriminalization and safe supply. How are some ways in which the government's approach to those programs is kind of designed to fail?
The cutoffs are way too low. I mean, 2.5 grams. I mean, some people do that much for breakfast, right? And it's really frustrating. And then assuming that people are high and they want to stop them and just check them out, that's not cool either, right? Because some people might have medical issues where they're taking medication that's legal, and it just puts them in that state of them looking like they're high on something else. And like smoking weed even, that's legal. But yet if you look stoned, they got every right to stop you. Now, come on, that's just too much. It's way too much. It's got to start working, with people, right? And meet them at where they're at, and not keep traumatizing them and forcing them to do things that they really shouldn't have to.
Yeah. And so, like, over here, our government has supposedly gone through decrim and introducing safe supply, but they've done it in a way where it's not actually accessible. So people are still getting arrested and they're still overdosing. But that's not because those programs can't work. That's because they didn't actually listen to people or build them out robustly enough. And it's hard not to see that cynically as intentional to justify not supporting people.
Anyone else with any pitfalls to avoid? Yep, go ahead. All
I
right.
think I'll jump in just to say, like, sometimes we do all these policies and all these outcomes happen, and in the name of efficiency, services get centralized. And when we see the centralization of services and supports happen, we end up creating this gatekeeping of resources. Speaking from our context here in Toronto, for instance, over the years, services have been gatekept and streamlined so that in theory, it's supposed to be more efficient and effective for people to access services. Except what's happening in real life is that all of the grassroots and community workers who have the deepest relationships with people can't access the resources that are available. And access to any shelters and housing is sort of kept to just like the main city department of shelters and housing. And that's really problematic because it means that a lot of people are not being able to access services. And I think I see that in different spaces across the sector in the name of efficiency and like collecting data. And what ends up happening is we've created policies that actually don't work. And we end up just losing a lot of people in the process.
Thanks. Now we've heard a lot of, horror stories. Any successes that can actually help inspire the plan? Yeah, Anna?
Just one small one. Back during Need a Place Tent City in so-called Maple Ridge, there was a lot of issues where fire departments were seizing people's tarps because they weren't, and like building wrap because it wasn't fire safe, and they were getting a lot of pushback over that. But then when they actually started showing up, BC Housing for a while funded the fire department. They walked around with the fire department and they had fire resistant tarps. And so they were showing up with the alternative. And so when they said, hey, we need you to take that down because that's not fire safe, but here is the alternative, no one fought with them. It was fine. And I just think it's a really simple but good example of how people do want to be safe. They just often can't afford the alternative. And so there's a way to collaborate around increasing safety in these spaces. It's just government needs to be prepared to provide the alternative in the moment they're taking what is safest right now.
Great. Any other inspiring success stories or successful approaches, Caroline?
En fait, moi, je tiens vraiment à mettre de l'avant une volonté municipale de faire autrement. Il y a une municipalité avec qui je collabore qui a organisé il n'y a pas tellement longtemps un dîner avec les personnes qui vivent dans un campement qui représentait certains enjeux de cohabitation. Fait qu'au lieu de faire de la répression, ils se sont mobilisés pour discuter avec elles, pour qu'elles prennent part aux solutions, pour justement favoriser un mieux-vivre collectif. Donc, je salue vraiment cet engagement-là. Ça démontre une volonté de vouloir agir dans une approche de droit, là, selon moi. Là. Donc, je tiens à le souligner.
Parfait. Lorraine? Nikki?
Yeah, Nikki wanted to share her story a little bit. And I think there was a link dropped in the chat earlier that she did a story with CBC. But so Nikki, you lived in an encampment. What do you think was helpful for you in getting out of the encampment?
Well, the city had placed some of us from the encampment beside sanctuary, that drop-in shelter, and they moved us to an abandoned, I guess, an empty building, low rise that was meant to be torn down further, like during the year, and so a bunch of us was placed there, and from there I was put into a shelter hotel, and that was a bad experience there, but I mean, a lot of street to health, I think, street to homes. There's an outreach housing workers that helped me get into where I'm at now. It's a building for women, YWCA, and so I've been able to get housed since 2021. 2021, I think I got into my apartment, and it's like a harm reduction apartment too, so building. So that kind of helps with being able to get adjusted to back into like home living and our kitchen and everything, and like responsibility chores and bills and stuff. Like, so there's workers there too in my building that help with that kind of.
I think a big one that you just said was the encampment was there and the city identified the encampment was not ideal, but they actually had an option for where to move people to that was dignified. It was like a temporary apartment building.
Yeah.
So they weren't just warehousing you somewhere.
I had a 2-bedroom apartment with my ex-partner, and then a friend of ours. We shared a 2-bedroom apartment together. So
yeah, so having
support, we
options
had
for
friends to
people.
support each other too.
Awesome. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This discussion has been absolutely incredible, and I want to make sure there's time for participants to ask questions. So I'm going to wrap this up, but I do want one last question to you. It's going to be a lightning round, and I'm going to be pretty rough. In a minute, can you tell us what's next for advocacy on this issue, and how can local advocates across the country keep supporting each other's work and sharing information? And how do we build a national movement for the human rights of people who are unhoused? Chris, I'm going to start with you.
It's a whole lot of cooperation. There's so many people who are on the ground doing important work here in Edmonton, and so many folks with lived experience who have so much important experience to share. It's collaborating together with legal professionals and hopefully both for the purpose of litigation and for organizing public pressure.
Okay, great. Gaia?
Opportunities like this, where information sharing and sharing insights on how different organizations are working to address and work with encampment communities and folks with lived experiences. And I think also cultivating that sense of creativity, right? So not thinking within the box, but ensuring that there is a more of a creative approach, and the acknowledgement that a one size fits all model doesn't exist when talking about issues surrounding precarious housing, homelessness, and encampments.
Hey, Kapanin.
Ben, sur mon côté, ben, l'idée d'un mouvement national est vraiment nécessaire. Je pense que j'ai vraiment beaucoup évolué là, à travers les nombreuses discussions là, pan-canadiennes là, qu'on a eues, pas rester en silo. Mais il ne faut vraiment pas oublier qu'un mouvement national, on doit vraiment inclure la voix des personnes, donner les ressources pour que les personnes dans les campements se mobilisent aussi, là, que ce soit un comité de gouvernance, tu sais, qui prennent, il y en a qui ont des capacités, puis il faut les valoriser. Donc, je tiens absolument que ça ne soit pas perdu de vue là, si on a une réponse nationale. Donc, voilà. Merci.
Nikki and Lorraine?
Oh, I'm looking for a way to communicate more. It's like, I don't know if it, somehow getting Wi-Fi in the different encampments across the city. I don't know if that's something, that's even, it could be considered.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I think connected to what Caroline was saying, and including the voices of people who are living outside, and people who are living outside need ways to communicate. So just having access to devices and Wi-Fi. I think for me, one part of a national movement is people to do the heavy lifting to actually educate the masses in terms of what's actually happening. So most people that I talk to don't even know like social assistance rates in Ontario are not livable. Like we need people to actually do this public education to try to move the masses in terms of people's understanding of the larger context.
Great, thank you. And Delilah and Anna.
Thank you. Yeah, echoing what others have said, one thing is keeping the conversation going, but also showing up when you can. Again, showing up on the ground when you can, being actually present, centering people's voices. So that includes if you're in a nonprofit, you're part of outreach work, that you are actually really ensuring that you're using your platform and connection to government wherever you have it to make sure that they have to talk to people directly and they're not just using you to act as a barrier between government and the people on the ground, because we see that happen too often. And yes, actually funding people to participate and making it accessible for them to participate. We set up a room today for people from Crab Park to come and watch this panel, but they can't leave the park because they're undergoing an immediate eviction and they have to keep their eyes on their stuff at all times. So, ceasing displacement means people can actually participate in processes that are about them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's pretty sad, when the people that we're fighting for can't even really be here because they just can't, right? And in regards to displacing of things and people, people's like ashes are getting destroyed, or handprints that are put in plaster of their kids are even being destroyed. Right, and that's not cool at all. I mean, karma's going to come back in a really bad way, I'm sure of it. And in regards to the Wi-Fi, City Vancouver just voted, and downtown Eastside is going to be getting Wi-Fi for everybody. I'm not too sure of how soon it will happen, but that's one of the blessings in disguise, so to speak. And yeah, I really look forward to the change, and kudos to everybody here who's trying their best to make it right for everybody.
Great. Well, thank you so much to everyone. I'm going to turn it back over to DJ now, who's going to lead us into another moderated discussion.
Ooh. And I'm going to take a little bit of a deep breath. That was amazing. And so much there. Incredible deep gratitude to all the panelists and Marie-Josée, to you. Wanted to open it up a little bit for some Q&A. We've been tracking the chat and the Q&A. It's been so active, which is amazing. And I feel like many of these things have been touched on. But I wanted to bring forward some of the questions that we've seen and see if the panelists would like to provide your thoughts on that. So one of the things that came up was that there's this real disconnect and tension between what happens in court and what legal teams say in those government spaces when it comes to rights and obligations. So there might be consultations where people are being brought in and conversations are happening around these real harms and realities and the need for folks to be treated in a way that recognizes their human rights. And then when you end up in a court process, you'll see things like forcefully arguing around these safety narratives, or that public spaces and parks are really for other members of the community who have housing, fighting against the existence of a right to housing that is enforceable, or saying that, you know, shelter and housing are available when in fact it might not be appropriate or it might be full. And so the question here is, how do we address that real disconnect between the conversation that is happening today and then what ends up happening in those legal processes? I don't want to assume who might want to respond to that, but I'd love to throw it over to the panel. And I know that Chris, Marie-Josée, Anna, and Delilah and folks might have some things to say about that, having been involved in those processes. So wondering if one of you'd like to jump in, and others as well, of course. Chris, I see ya.
Yeah, I don't have any ideas for how to improve the situation, but I can say the disconnect is real. The difference between what the city of Edmonton puts out publicly in press statements and what the mayor puts out publicly in press statements is so much different than what the city of Edmonton's lawyers filed in their briefs. Just a couple examples. The city of Edmonton in January declared a housing emergency. Well, a couple months prior, in response to our application that our injunction be treated as an emergency, city lawyers argued that there was no emergency because houselessness had been an issue for years. Another issue is that when we tried to qualify some of our experts, or rather in response to some of our experts, the city lawyers questioned their expertise. One of the grounds for questioning our expertise was that some of them had cited international law, international human rights law, and the city lawyers had questioned whether their references in public materials to international human rights law undermine their expertise. So the gap is significant, and I don't have any ideas for how to improve it.
Anna, do you want to hop in?
Yeah, again, like Chris and other lawyers who've tried to advance people's rights through the courts, the disconnect is very real. I think many people here already know that disconnect is because we are fighting with colonial laws to push back against colonial systems. So to be a social justice lawyer is to recognize that you are using a violent tool to try and reduce harm. We can't actually end violence against Indigenous peoples and other peoples who've been displaced using colonial laws that displaced entire Indigenous legal systems of governance. So it's not a simple answer, but just to say that, like, we need to keep pushing those courts because they exist and that's an option. But often it is the public outcry and the media coverage and the disparities between what's happening in court and what's happening in the media, that is actually just as big of a part of the conversation. And yeah, just a call to all legal workers to, like, keep doing what you do, but continue to name that we won't solve this through the courts, and we desperately need those other, we need to support movements on the ground and the public pressure that can lead to that really systemic change.
Yeah, and food for thought, you know, if all the chiefs and the tribal council of all the different nations were to get together and give the colonial people or colonials 1 week to get off the land, I wonder what kind of what would happen then, like how much, you know, what would happen. I was thinking about that, you know, and I just want to put it out there for food for thought. Like if they're saying, no, you need to leave, you got 1 week, pack up, get out, right? We want our land back, right? So.
Thanks, Delilah.
Mm-hmm.
Depends on your golf courses. Oops.
I'd love to jump on that for a second. I just think I would love for us to societally reframe our understanding of land. You know, there's nothing more troubling than sitting in a meeting with policymakers who read a land acknowledgement and then the next part of the agenda item is how do we clear tents? It is absolutely horrifying. So, you know, I think the way we talk about land and who is considered public, who's allowed access to public space is really problematic, right? So, you know, so I agree with what Anna was saying in terms of the colonial system that we have, and like even the legal system is part of that whole thing, but our understanding of land is still that land is a commodity as opposed to land as treaties that we've broken, right? And so I think that would dramatically change the way we look at who's allowed to be on land. And I think that's such a huge part of this conversation right now.
Anybody else? Okay. There's a lot in there. It's like using the courts as necessity and recognizing that there's much beyond that that needs to happen in different ways of advocating, which maybe brings me to the next question. There was a question about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act here in BC. There's also a federal piece of legislation in that regard. There was a question about, you know, does that legislation or could that legislation assist communities in developing advocacy for more equitable policies and bylaws, things of that nature. And if anyone has any thoughts on those pieces of legislation, if that's feeling like it could be of assistance, if not, why not? And where else do you think folks can turn? Wondering if anyone has thoughts on that. I don't want to, I find it awkward to point to people. Gail, I don't know if you have thoughts on that or if anyone else does. Anna, I see your hand up as well.
I've spoken a lot, so Gail, if you have thoughts on this, please. I think I just want to flag that without knowing all of the ins and outs, is that UNDRIP and its adoption by our provincial government is a perfect example of doing something publicly that sounds like you are moving forward with reconciliation and then sending lawyers to court to argue against it being interpreted in a robust way. That is exactly what our provincial government has done. So they put the adoption of UNDRIP up on their website. They reference that to get the platform of doing work around reconciliation, and then they actively argue in court about it being actually applied in a way that will hold them accountable. And this is just an ask to every government actor on this call and every lawyer who's done that work. You're actually avoiding using the courts for cover. Like the courts can enforce things. The courts can hold your hands and make it so you unavoidably have to protect people better. But you have to stop arguing about things being interpreted in robust ways. You have to actually let the courts come to conclusions that will hold you accountable. And right now you're fighting even that.
I guess just to kind of piggyback off of what Anna had so eloquently mentioned, it's just that accountability mechanism and ensuring that it is being honored and upheld. A lot of times, right, from what I've heard from the Friendship Center movement as well, it's, you know, they ask like, who is responsible for this? Who are we meant to go to for these supports or for these questions? And, you know, and there's never a clear answer. And then it falls back to community. It falls back to the frontline workers to find ways. And again, going back to the point of creativity, finding ways to continue to prioritize supporting folks that are unhoused and that are living in encampments. And so it creates a sense of fatigue. And a lot of frontline workers and even folks that are working within the housing and homelessness sector, they experience burnout and there's no support for them too. And that is due to the lack of accountability and the accountability mechanisms that are being in place to ensure that all levels of government are upholding their responsibility in the title that, or the responsibilities that they uphold. Yeah. So thank you.
So maybe moving to some of the more practical things, and there may be some stuff coming out from the report and the recommendations around what's to come next is A note that there needs to be a more standardized countrywide response to encampments. Every city seems to treat them differently. Some are really at that far end of not respecting people's human rights. There needs to be more education about this. So who needs that education? What does that need to be, and what does it need to look like? Who needs to be more involved with encampments, and what sectors of workers might need to take a less active role? If you're okay with it, Marie-Josée, do you mind if I turn to you first for any thoughts you have on that?
For sure. I think, you know, the challenge of writing a national report is that every region is very different. You know, the thing that they all have in common is that they have encampments, and encampments can look very different from one place to another. Sometimes it's a tent in a family backyard, and sometimes it's a string of tents here and there, small clusters of people who know each other, trust each other, and are together to protect one another. And sometimes they're very, very large encampments. Some of them are sanctioned, some of them are not. Some of them, the encampments have had support of municipalities, and some of them have absolutely not. And then there's also snapshots in time. You know, there's some municipalities that have been very supportive and wanting to do the right thing and adopt a human rights approach to encampments. And then, but then there's no solutions. And, you know, the people that, you know, if there's an election coming up, suddenly the public rhetoric changes and it's not supportive anymore. And it's, you know, because people are tired. But so then suddenly people in encampments are dehumanized, and everything is used to be weaponized against the people in encampments, such as safety. You know, things that are supposed to be there to protect people are used against them. So, you know, everything's a snapshot in time. It's very tricky, and the ground is moving all the time. It's to recognize that every community has different resources, and every community is at a different place with regards to encampments. So I feel that, you know, I'm really grateful that Toronto has you know, housing ombuds person. I think every community needs one of those in order to guide municipal governments and you know, people working with the municipal governments to look at a report such as mine and be able to adopt it and guide governments to adopt it at the local level. That's the beginning. And to do it you know, by respecting human rights approach, because everyone has their solutions, but they're certainly not all human rights compliant. And that's what we really need. And this is what this country needs to understand. This is new. What does it mean? You know, I'm hearing, you know, we've got a list of these things that we do. You know, we engage with Indigenous people, we engage with people with lived experience, but is it done in a meaningful way? And that is really what it comes down to. So what does it mean? That would be the beginning point of education.
Does anyone else want to hop in on that? Je suis désolée, I haven't called on you yet, but Lorraine, I see that you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's a
Ben,
question.
en fait, je voulais juste rajouter aussi que les discours peuvent être contradictoires souvent, puis un jour, il va falloir qu'on trouve un point de repère parce que souvent, il y en a qui pèsent plus que d'autres dans certains discours, puis ça vient justement nuire à la vraie réponse qui pourrait vraiment bénéficier les personnes qui vivent en campement. Donc, de vraiment faire attention, là, comme un peu Marie-Josée disait, tout le monde a ses solutions, mais à un moment donné, c'est de se recentrer puis de voir, OK, mais quel dommage ou quel impact que ces décisions-là, d'avoir une pensée plus systémique sur nos actions là, pour vraiment atténuer là, la répression, toutes les oppressions que les personnes en campement vivent. Donc.
I think to Marie-José's point about Toronto having a housing ombudsman, the conversation and questions that keep coming up amongst my colleagues is what teeth is there though in the ombudsman reports? And there's just so much confusion in terms of what these reports are actually going to do, what meaning they actually have. So I know that a lot of folks often reach out to the ombudsman here, whether it's housing or whatever it is. And then we know that there's, you know, conversations and like reports done, but what teeth is there? You know, in Toronto now we have the Housing Secretariat department, but most of my colleagues and myself have no idea what the Housing Secretariat does. and they came from Vancouver. So I don't know, things in Vancouver aren't looking so great. So I'm not really sure what's happening. And I think there's often this disconnect in terms of people who are in these positions of policymaking power and the people who are working in this space and the people who are living outside. And I think to the point about meaningful consultation that's come up a few times, and Nikki and I talked about this yesterday, was, governments pay consultants this enormous amount for their time, and they go to encampments and offer a $10 gift card to people living outside. I think that's grossly offensive. People who are living in encampments, informing your policies, are consultants. So they should deserve the same kind of honorarium that people at Deloitte or Ernst & Young or whoever it is that's sitting in their offices consulting on policies without lived experience. So I actually think if we're talking about meaningful consultation with people who are living outside, it's not just here's some water and gift cards. We need to actually meet people where they're at, go to the parks. And I'll say, in Toronto,
Spend the night outside.
Nikki says spend a night outside. But in Toronto, like a number of times we have asked decision makers to come and do a circle, have a space at the encampment. And there was like zero desire to follow up on that. And so if we really are serious about addressing this issue, like this conversation is great, but the fact that it's happening over a virtual Zoom is also probably not going to help this conversation move further. And so I would love to see actual accountability happen and meaningful engagement with the people. Hire the people who are living in encampments. The same people who are complaining about the people who live in encampments, they should just go get a job. Well, here's an idea. Maybe people in policy decision-making places can give people who are living outside work that's meaningful to create policy changes, because we all know that the people who are the best outreach workers are the same people that are living outside. So I just think we need to start thinking outside the box to actually see things change, because we're just kind of running in the same circles with new reports that say the same thing. Yeah.
Oh, so much nodding, so many hearts in the chat. I promised to keep us on time, so I'm going to do that. There's so many more questions that folks would love to ask, and some of them have been answered in the chat, and I hope that there'll be follow-up conversation. But on that note, deep thanks to everyone on this panel. And I think one of the things we come back to and was in a number of the questions is this question of community. Everyone, the only certainty in life is not taxes. It is that we have to put our body somewhere. And when someone is putting their body in a public space, it is because it is the safest, best, and perhaps only place for people to be. So from this panel, moving from that fear that people experience sometimes, and how do we create real active policy change, centering people, employing people who are living in encampments, and Caroline, as you mentioned, weighing whose feedback matters most in terms of who is most harmed and who has the best information for us. So as we end off today, so deeply thankful to the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate for your work, to NHRN for hosting this, and to all of these amazing panelists. I hope people leave feeling inspired to not just listen and learn from this, but to act. Promise yourself that you will take an action based on what you learned today. And to help you out with that, the National Right to Housing Network has launched an encampments landing page with a toolkit. And so I think that's going to pop up on the screen. The landing page is a place to go if you have more questions or you're looking for more resources. It's a place to, get a bit more information. And obviously you can also reach out to the folks who've been here today to continue this conversation. The toolkit that you can find on that landing page is available in French and English. It includes a letter to the editor draft to give people some framework and some suggestions on how to do that. Letters to all levels of municipal, provincial, territorial, and federal government actors, and some social media content for folks who would love to talk about this more in those social media spaces. So take a look at it, get learning, share it with your community, get active, have that conversation with your uncle, because we need to move into a space where we're working collectively and together. Elected officials need to know that this is a priority concern. We know that they need to hear that this is a concern and that it's a concern to people across the country in order to act, and that it is not punishment and displacement that is the answer. We know that the advocate has been calling for a National Encampment Response Plan. That needs to be supported. People need to know that that is a priority and that it needs to be robust. And so let's move out of today, recognizing that we're in an unprecedented moment. For the first time, we have this advocate office who is dedicated to housing rights and human rights-based approaches to housing. We have people with lived expertise and knowledge who are offering solutions, and we're building a system for action and accountability. And that system needs your support. So stay connected. When the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate receives a response from the minister to the report, that response will be shared out. Stay in touch, follow the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate and the Right to Housing Network. And again, deepest thanks to all of you for everything you've done today and everything you do every single day. And I hope that those joining here are leaving better informed and really deeply inspired to be a part of the change that we need. So my hands are up to you. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care and have a wonderful day.